The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair Beaumont, considered his new wife across the expanse of the dining table. It was an impressive expanse, a continent of polished mahogany that reflected the candlelight from the silver candelabra in long, distorted streaks. The table, like the title, was an inheritance. So, it seemed, was the woman who sat at its far end. She was Miss Elara Vance no longer. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, a fact that felt both legally indisputable and profoundly abstract. He had acquired her, as he had acquired the new pair of matched bays for his carriage, for a specific purpose and with careful consideration of her attributes. Her lineage was acceptable, if not dazzling. Her family's finances were in a state of spectacular ruin, which made her father pliable. She was reputedly quiet, possessed of a modest education, and most critically unlikely to cause trouble. He had required a duchess to produce an heir and manage the domestic sphere of his life, which had run to a state of masculine disarray since his mother's retirement to the dower house. He required competence, not companionship, silence, not sentiment. He had outlined these requirements in a letter to his solicitor, Mr. Hemlock, a man for whom sentiment was a foreign currency. "The arrangement is settled," he had written in his precise, unadorned script. "Miss Vance will suffice. She is plain and quiet, possessing little conversation, but, I am assured, a great deal of domestic sense. At least she is not the sort to cause a scene or embarrass this family with undue opinions. She understands her duty." It was a cold assessment, but Alistair was not a man given to warmth. His life was a structure of duties, obligations, and assets. Elara Vance was now an asset, intended to shore up a dynastic obligation. In the 3 weeks since their wedding, a brisk, efficient ceremony, devoid of any celebratory excess, she had proven his assessment correct. She was quiet. She was efficient. The household, under the previous stewardship of a well-meaning but increasingly forgetful housekeeper, had been brought to a state of gleaming, silent perfection. Meals appeared on time. Linens were crisp. The staff moved with a newfound purpose, their expressions a mixture of respect and, Alistair noted with detached curiosity, a fierce sort of loyalty to their new mistress. She was a perfect manager, an exemplary administrator. She was, in every respect, fulfilling her side of their unspoken bargain. And yet, he watched her now. Her head was bent slightly over her plate of roasted pheasant. The candlelight caught the soft curve of her neck and the intricate coil of her brown hair. Plain, he had called her. It was not, he supposed, an entirely accurate description. Her features were not fashionable, not the doll-like prettiness that graced the London ballrooms. They were composed. Her eyes, which he had initially catalogued as a simple brown, were in fact the color of dark amber, and when she did, on rare occasion, look directly at him, they were alarmingly perceptive. Section is. She ate with a delicate precision, her movements economical and graceful. She did not speak unless spoken to, and when she did, her voice was low and clear. She had not offered a single opinion on any topic of substance, from the political turmoil in France to the proposed draining of the South Meadow. She was a placid surface, a calm and undisturbed pool. He found it intensely irritating. The silence in the grand dining room was a physical presence. It was broken only by the clink of silver on porcelain and the discreet footsteps of the footman, a young man named Thomas, who moved with the ghostly quiet of the well-trained. Alistair cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. "The new accounts for the tenant farms were on my desk this morning," he said. It was not a question, but a statement intended to provoke a response. "Mrs. Gable informs me you requested them." Elara looked up. Her amber eyes met his for a brief moment before flicking down to a point just past his shoulder. "Yes. I thought it prudent to understand the estate's income streams." Her voice was perfectly modulated, calm, uninterested. "And did you?" he pressed. "Did I what? Your Grace?" "Understand them." A small, almost imperceptible pause. "They are quite straightforward, though I did notice a discrepancy in the wool receipts from the northern flock." The yield seems 20% lower than the previous year, yet the flock size has increased. I have made a note to speak with the bailiff. She returned her attention to her pheasant. Alistair stared at her. He had spent 2 days poring over those same ledgers and had not noticed the discrepancy. He had been focused on the larger figures, the totals and losses. She had found a leak in his ship with a single, passing glance. He felt a prickle of something he could not name. It was not annoyance. It was not admiration. It was recalibration. His initial assessment of her was being subtly, quietly dismantled. "Indeed," he said, his own voice sounding stiff. "I will see that you have his report." "Thank you," she murmured, and the silence descended once more, heavier than before. She was present, and she was absent. She was there, and she was not there. He was dining with a ghost in a duchess's gown, a ghost who could, apparently, balance accounts better than his own Cambridge-educated mind. This was not what he had expected. He had expected a quiet woman, yes, but one with a certain degree of presence. A gentle, feminine energy that would soften the hard, masculine edges of Blackwood Manor. Instead, she had brought a silence so profound it was like a sound in itself. She moved through the grand, echoing rooms of the manor like a wraith, leaving behind only evidence of her competence: polished floors, perfectly arranged flowers, balanced books. He had married a function, not a person. But then, that was what he had wanted, wasn't it? The next day, he found himself observing her. It was a conscious act, like a naturalist observing a new and puzzling species. He watched her in the morning room, where she sat not with embroidery, but with a thick book on crop rotation. He saw her in the gardens, speaking quietly with the head gardener, her gloved finger tracing the line of a blighted rose stem. The gardener, a notoriously cantankerous man named Finch, was nodding, his expression one of deep concentration. Alistair had never seen Finch look at anyone with anything other than suspicion. He heard her too. Or rather, he did not hear her. In the first week of their marriage, before the silence had fully taken root, he had heard the distant, gentle sound of the pianoforte in the afternoons. The melodies were complex, melancholic pieces he did not recognize. He had found them a pleasant, unobtrusive backdrop to his work. The music had stopped 3 days ago. He had not consciously noted its cessation at the time. He only now realized its absence. The house felt flatter without it. Emptier. The inciting incident for this profound quiet, this complete and total withdrawal of self, had been, though he did not yet know it, a single sheet of foolscap. 2 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday, Ilara had entered his study. It was a room she had been explicitly told was his private domain, but she had a household question that required his signature. She had knocked, and receiving no answer, had pushed the door open a crack. The room was empty. Alistair was out with his bailiff. On his vast mahogany desk, amidst a sea of important papers, lay a single, half-folded letter. It was not sealed. Her eyes, trained to notice details, caught her own name, Miss Vance. Curiosity, an emotion she rarely indulged, stirred within her. She was not a spy, nor was she given to snooping. But this was a letter about her, written by the man who was now her husband. It felt less like an invasion of privacy and more like essential reconnaissance. Her hand, steady and pale, reached out and picked it up. She read the clean, sharp lines of his handwriting. She read the cold, transactional words. "The arrangement is settled. Miss Vance will suffice. She is plain and quiet, possessing little conversation, but, I am assured, a great deal of domestic sense. At least she is not the sort to cause a scene or embarrass this family with undue opinions. She understands her duty." Ilara read the paragraph twice. Her face remained perfectly composed. No tears sprang to her eyes. Her breath did not catch. The world did not tilt on its axis. Instead, a profound and terrible clarity settled over her. It was not the insult that struck her. She had no illusions about her own beauty or her place in the world. She had been a commodity on the marriage market, a solution to her family's debt. It was the chilling accuracy of his dismissal. He had purchased a quiet, competent machine to run his house and bear his children. He had not married a woman. He had acquired a duchess. She had, in the weeks leading up to the marriage, allowed a sliver of hope to germinate, a foolish, tender green shoot in the barren soil of her reality. She had hoped that perhaps, behind his cold exterior, there might be a man capable of seeing her. Seeing the mind that devoured books on philosophy and agriculture, the soul that found solace in the complex mathematics of a Bach fugue, the dry, sharp wit she kept carefully sheathed. The letter cut that tender shoot at the root. He wanted a duchess who would not embarrass him with undue opinions. He wanted a function, an automaton. Very well, she thought, a cold calm descending upon her. She would give him exactly what he had paid for. She folded the letter with meticulous care, replacing the crease exactly where it had been. She placed it back on the desk, precisely in its original position. Then she turned, left the study, and quietly closed the door behind her. The click of the latch was the only sound. It was the sound of a door closing not just on a room, but on a possibility. From that moment on, Ilara began her performance. She became the Duchess of Blackwood, as described in the letter. She was a paragon of quiet efficiency. She ran the household with the precision of a military campaign. Her conversations were models of polite brevity. She offered no opinions. She caused no scenes. She played no music. She did not laugh, or smile, or show any flicker of the sharp intelligence that burned within her. She erased herself, leaving only the title and the function. She understood her duty. Alistair, oblivious, was left to grapple with the consequences of a crime he did not know he had committed. He knew only that his perfectly managed house felt like a mausoleum. He knew that his quiet wife was not merely quiet. She was absent. He had wished for a duchess who was not a nuisance, and he had gotten one who was, in essence, not there at all. It was maddening. He began to test her, leaving books on political theory open on the drawing-room table, making deliberately provocative statements about the government at dinner. She would meet his conversational gambits with a polite, empty smile and a non-committal murmur. She would not be drawn. She had read his terms and conditions, and she was adhering to them perfectly. He found himself thinking about her at odd hours. He thought about the way her brow furrowed in concentration over the ledgers. He thought about the brief, surprising flash of humor he'd seen in her eyes on their wedding day, a flicker he had dismissed at the time and now desperately wished to see again. He thought about the discrepancy in the wool receipts. He was a man who solved problems. The problem, he concluded, was that his wife was boring, terribly, profoundly boring. This was a miscalculation on his part. He had underestimated his own need for at least a modicum of intellectual stimulation. His solution, as always, was a practical one. He needed a distraction. He announced one morning that he would be traveling to London for a week. "Business," he said. "Parliament." Ilara received the news with the same placid equanimity with which she received all news. "Very well. Your Grace, I will have your things packed. Will you require your valet to accompany you?" There was no flicker of disappointment, no hint of curiosity. He could have been announcing a trip to the stables for all the emotion she showed. "Yes," he said, clipped and sharp. "I will." He left the following morning. As his carriage rattled down the long, oak-lined drive, he looked back at the grand facade of Blackwood Manor. There was no one at the window, no handkerchief waving farewell, just the imposing silent stone of the house. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of something. He dismissed it as indigestion. London was a flurry of noise and activity, a welcome assault on the senses after the profound quiet of his home. He met with his solicitor, attended 2 dull sessions in the House of Lords, and dined with friends who spoke of horses, politics, and women, all with the same casual, proprietary air. Lord Ashworth, a man whose primary intellectual pursuit was the avoidance of his own wife, clapped him on the back. "How is married life treating you, Blackwood?" Found your Duchess to be everything you'd hoped? Alistair thought of the silence. He thought of the amber eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. He thought of the empty pianoforte. She is a model of efficiency, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Ashworth roared with laughter. Efficiency? By God, you make her sound like a new type of steam engine. Is she at least decorative? She is composed, Alistair replied, the word tasting no better. He returned to Blackwood Manor a day earlier than planned. The city had failed to distract him. It had only sharpened the contrast with the silence that awaited him. He told himself he was returning early to deal with an urgent estate matter. He was not a man who fled from boredom towards something he could not define. He was not a man who missed his own wife's absence. He entered the house unannounced. The great hall was silent, as expected. But it was a different quality of silence. It was not empty. From the far end of the hall, through the open doors of the grand ballroom, came the sound of music. It was the pianoforte. The melody was not the gentle, melancholic air he remembered. It was a piece of staggering complexity and passion, a torrent of notes that spoke of frustration and longing, and a fierce, burning intelligence. It was a storm of a piece, beautiful and violent. Alistair stood, frozen, in the hall. He had never heard music like it. It was raw and alive, a stark contrast to the placid, controlled woman he thought he had married. He moved silently, drawn by the sound, until he stood in the doorway of the ballroom. Elara sat at the grand piano, her back to him. Her body, usually held with such rigid composure, was fluid and expressive, swaying with the tempestuous rhythm of the music. Her fingers flew across the keys, not with the delicate precision of a drawing-room musician, but with the power and confidence of a virtuoso. This was not the quiet, simple woman from the letter. This was someone else entirely. This was a stranger. He watched, unseen, for a full 5 minutes as she wrestled with the piece, pouring into it all the emotion she so carefully concealed from the world. When the final, crashing chord faded into the vast emptiness of the ballroom, the ensuing silence was more profound than any that had come before. She sat for a long moment, her shoulders slumped, her head bowed. Then she straightened, her posture once again becoming the rigid, controlled line he recognized. She closed the lid of the pianoforte. The sound was a soft, definitive thud. As she turned, she saw him. For a single, unguarded second, he saw a flash of panic in her eyes. It was the look of a wild creature caught unexpectedly in a trap. Then, instantly, the mask of placid composure snapped back into place. "Your Grace," she said, her voice perfectly even. "I did not expect you until tomorrow." He ignored the pleasantry. He was still reeling from the music. "I did not know you played," he said. The words were inadequate. They were a bucket of water thrown on a forest fire. "It is a minor accomplishment," she replied, her eyes fixed on a point over his shoulder. "A way to pass the time. A minor accomplishment." The phrase was so absurd, so patently false, that it was almost a physical blow. The music he had just heard was the work of a lifetime, not a hobby. She was lying to him, erecting a wall of polite falsehoods between them. "That was not a minor accomplishment," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "What was it?" "Just a piece I have been working on," she said, her voice still infuriatingly calm. She moved to walk past him, a subtle dismissal. He stepped into her path. He was not a man who was dismissed in his own home. Elara. It was the first time he had used her given name without a title attached. The sound of it hung in the air between them, unfamiliar and sharp. She stopped. She did not look at him, but her stillness was absolute. "I would prefer," he said, struggling to articulate the chaos in his mind, "that you did not cease your playing on my account." A small, bitter smile touched her lips for a fleeting moment. It was a devastating expression. "I would not wish to disturb you, Your Grace. You require a quiet house." And then she was gone, gliding past him and out of the ballroom, leaving him alone with the ghost of the music and a growing, sickening sense of his own profound ignorance. He had been wrong. The thought was so novel, so utterly alien to his experience of the world, that it stopped him in his tracks. Alistair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood, was not a man who was wrong. He made calculated decisions based on available data, and yet the data had been flawed. The asset he had acquired was not the one he had catalogued. He had called her plain, quiet, and possessed of little conversation. He had just witnessed a display of passionate, complex artistry that was the very antithesis of that description. She was not a placid pool. She was a deep, turbulent ocean, and she had allowed him to see only the calm, controlled surface. Why? The question lodged itself in his mind and refused to be dislodged. He was a man of logic. There had to be a reason, a cause for this effect. Her behavior was a deliberate choice, a performance, and it had begun, he calculated, about 2 weeks ago. What had happened 2 weeks ago? He could not recall any specific event, any argument or disagreement. Their interactions had been uniformly polite and distant. It was a puzzle, and Alistair, for the first time in his life, felt completely unequipped to solve it. His unease began to coalesce into a kind of obsession. He started noticing more. He noticed the books she left in the drawing room were not novels, but works of Greek philosophy, in the original Greek. He noticed that when she thought no one was watching, her expression was not placid, but weary and sad. He noticed that she spoke to the servants not as a mistress to her underlings, but as a respected commander to her troops, with a quiet authority that engendered fierce loyalty. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, had been with the family for 40 years. She was a woman of formidable opinions and a deep-seated skepticism of any new mistress of the house. Alistair found her one afternoon in the linen closet, a rare, genuine smile on her face. "The new Duchess, Your Grace," she said, without preamble, "is a remarkable woman. She reorganized the entire pantry system in a single morning, found 3 years' worth of unaccounted-for brandy, and she speaks to young Thomas as if he were a man, not a boy. He'd walk into fire for her." Alistair nodded, a knot tightening in his stomach. "She is efficient." Mrs. Gable's smile vanished. She gave him a long, shrewd look, the kind she had been giving him since he was a boy who'd tracked mud on her clean floors. "She is a great deal more than that, Your Grace, if you'd take the trouble to see it." The mild rebuke from a trusted servant struck him more forcefully than any parliamentary debate. If you'd take the trouble to see it. The implication was clear. He had not taken the trouble. He had looked, but he had not seen. The catalyst, the final piece of the puzzle, arrived in the form of a letter from his mother. The Dowager Duchess of Blackwood was a woman of formidable will and even more formidable perception. She had ruled Blackwood for 30 years with an iron fist and a velvet glove, and she did not suffer fools, especially when one of them was her own son. "Alistair," the letter began, dispensing with any affectionate preamble, "I find my curiosity piqued. You have been married for over a month, and I have yet to meet the woman who is to continue our line. Your descriptions of her have been laconic. You will bring her to the Dower House for luncheon. I shall expect you both by Sunday." It was not a request. It was a royal summons. Alistair felt a surge of dread so profound, it was almost comical. He imagined his mother's sharp, intelligent eyes dissecting Ilara's placid, silent performance. He imagined the polite, empty conversation. He imagined his mother's subsequent interrogation of him. He had written to his mother shortly after the engagement, echoing the sentiments from his letter to the solicitor. He had described Ilara as a sensible, quiet girl who will not give us any trouble. He had painted a picture of a simple, biddable creature. He was now going to have to present a silent automaton. "She will embarrass this family," he had written, in a moment of supreme arrogance, dismissing any woman with a mind of her own. The irony was that Ilara's current performance, the very embodiment of the woman he thought he wanted, was precisely what was going to cause him acute social embarrassment in front of the one person whose opinion he truly valued. He informed Ilara, of the summons at dinner. My mother wishes to meet you. We will go to the Dower House on Sunday. Of course, Ilara said, her face a perfect, unreadable mask. What time should I be ready? Her complete lack of anxiety was, perversely, the most anxiety-inducing thing of all. Sunday arrived, a day of brilliant, unforgiving sunshine. The drive to the Dower House was conducted in near total silence. Alistair rehearsed explanations in his head. She is shy. She is overwhelmed by her new position. They all sounded thin and false, even to him. The Dowager Duchess, a small, bird-like woman with eyes as sharp as black diamonds, greeted them at the door. She kissed Alistair's cheek, then turned her full, formidable attention to Ilara. "So," she said, her voice dry as sherry. "You are the one who has finally brought my son to heel." Ilara curtsied gracefully. "It is an honor to meet you, Your Grace." Her voice was polite, quiet, and utterly devoid of personality. Alistair watched his mother's eyes narrow slightly. The assessment had begun. Luncheon was a masterclass in social tension. The Dowager directed a barrage of questions at Ilara, probing questions about her family, her education, her interests. Ilara answered each one with placid, brief, and infuriatingly uninformative responses. "And what do you do to occupy your time at Blackwood, my dear? Do you find the country dull after the city?" "I find my duties sufficient to occupy my time, Your Grace." "Duties? Alistair makes you sound like a housekeeper. Surely you have hobbies. Music? Reading?" Alistair saw a flicker of something in Ilara's eyes, a brief, painful shadow before it was extinguished. "I have little time for such things." Alistair felt a muscle in his jaw clench. She was lying. She was deliberately presenting herself as a simpleton, and he had no idea why, even as a sick suspicion began to dawn in the pit of his stomach. After the meal, the Dowager led them into her prized rose garden. She began to speak of the challenges of cultivating a new French hybrid, the Souvenir de la Malmaison. She used complex horticultural terms, discussing rootstock and blight and soil acidity. "Finch tells me it is impossible in this northern climate," she concluded, with a sharp look at Ilara. "He says the soil is too heavy." Alistair waited for Ilara's polite, non-committal murmur. Instead, she was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the struggling rosebush. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. The placid emptiness was gone, replaced by a quiet authority. "Finch is mistaken," she said softly. "The soil is not the issue. It is the morning sun. It warms the frozen buds too quickly, causing them to blacken and fall. It needs to be planted against a western wall, where it will be shaded until midday, and the soil needs more sand to improve the drainage." The Dowager Duchess was perfectly still. She stared at Ilara, not with suspicion, but with a dawning, intense respect. Ilara seemed to realize what she had done. The mask snapped back into place. "Or so I have read," she added, her voice once again flat and lifeless. "I am no expert, of course, but it was too late." The curtain had been pulled back for a moment, and the Dowager had seen what lay behind it. On the carriage ride home, the silence was no longer empty. It was charged, heavy with unspoken things. Alistair did not know what to say. He had just witnessed his wife, the woman he had dismissed as having no undue opinions, effortlessly correct a point of horticultural science that had baffled his mother and the most experienced gardener in the county. When they returned to Blackwood, a footman informed Alistair that his mother's man had delivered a note for him. He took it to his study, his hands feeling strangely clumsy. The note was brief and brutal. "Alistair, I have never known you to be a fool, but I am now forced to reconsider my opinion. You told me you had married a simpleton. You have, in fact, married a woman of formidable intelligence, and you are either too arrogant to see it or too stupid to appreciate it. Whatever you have done to make that brilliant woman hide herself away, I suggest you undo it immediately." The note slipped from his fingers. "Whatever you have done." He stared around his study, the room that was the heart of his power, his logic, his control, and his eyes fell upon the desk, upon the neat stacks of papers, and a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. The letter to his solicitor. He had left it out. He remembered being called away urgently by the bailiff. He had left it, half-folded, right there in the center of his desk. He began to search, his movements frantic. He tore through the drawers, the filing cabinets. It was not a recent letter. It would have been archived. He found the folder for the month of his engagement. He pulled it out, his heart hammering against his ribs. And there it was, the letter, his own precise, cruel handwriting. He stared at it, but he was not reading the words. He was looking at the paper itself, at the creases. There was the original fold he had made, but there was another, fainter crease, a ghost of a fold, as if someone had opened it and then taken great care to refold it exactly as they had found it. The room swam. The pieces of the puzzle, the disconnected observations of the past weeks, slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. The music stopping, the silence at dinner, the lack of opinions, the polite, empty smiles, the perfect, chilling adherence to his own callous description. She had seen it. She had read his dismissal of her, his cold, clinical assessment, and she had, with a quiet, devastating precision, given him exactly what he had asked for. It was not submission. It was an act of rebellion, so subtle, so intelligent, that he had been completely blind to it. She had held up a mirror to his own monstrous arrogance, and he had not even recognized his own reflection. He sank into his chair, the letter clutched in his hand. The silence of the house was no longer an irritation. It was an accusation. Every quiet corner, every polished surface, every empty room screamed his failure. He had not married a simpleton. He had married a genius. And he had broken her spirit. No, that was not right. He had not broken it. He had merely forced it into hiding. He thought of the music in the ballroom, the passionate, stormy torrent of notes. That was her. That was the woman he had married, the woman he had insulted and dismissed and catalogued like a piece of livestock. He felt a wave of self-loathing so intense it made him physically sick. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He was powerful and respected, and in that moment, he had never felt so small. He had to find her. He had to, what? Apologize? The word seemed pathetically inadequate. How could he apologize for a sin he hadn't even been aware of committing? It was not about an apology. It was about a confession of his own blindness. He stood up, his purpose clear and absolute. He left the study and began to search the house. She was not in the drawing room, nor the morning room, nor the library. He knew, with a sudden certainty, where she would be. At the far end of the west wing was a vast, neglected conservatory. Its glass panes were clouded with grime, and its interior was a tangle of dead and dying exotic plants, relics of his grandfather's horticultural ambitions. He had passed it 100 times and never given it a thought. He pushed open the creaking door. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. And there, in the center of the ruin, was Alara. She was on her knees, a pair of gardening gloves on her hands, carefully tending to a single, struggling orchid that had somehow survived the neglect. She was so absorbed in her task that she did not hear him approach. Her face, in the dappled, dusty light, was not placid. It was alive with concentration and tenderness and a quiet, fierce determination. This was her. This was the real woman. "Ilara," he said, his voice rough. She started, her head snapping up. The mask fell into place, but this time he saw the effort it took. He saw the flicker of her true self before it was hidden away. "Your Grace," she said, getting to her feet and brushing the dirt from her skirt. He held up the letter. He did not need to explain what it was. He saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the sudden, sharp intake of breath. "I found this," he said. "In my study." She said nothing. Her face was a sculpture of neutrality. He took a step closer. "I am a fool," he said. The words were not an apology. They were a statement of fact, a diagnosis. I am an arrogant, blind fool. He saw a crack in her composure, a tremor in her perfect stillness. I wrote those words, he continued, his voice low and raw, and I believed them. I looked at you, and I saw nothing. I saw a solution to a problem, a quiet, useful thing to run my house. I did not see a woman who could bring a dead garden back to life, or understand the complexities of a Bach fugue, or see the truth of an estate ledger in a single glance. I did not see the woman my mother recognized in a single afternoon. He stopped, his throat tight. He looked at her, truly looked at her. For the first time, he saw the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw, the deep well of resilience that had allowed her to endure his casual cruelty with such devastating grace. I was wrong, he said. It was the hardest and most necessary sentence he had ever uttered. I was wrong about everything. Alara stared at him. The mask was gone. In its place was a profound vulnerability, a deep and ancient hurt. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "Why are you telling me this now?" she whispered, her voice fragile. "Because," he said, taking another step until he was standing just before her, "I do not wish to live in a mausoleum with a ghost. I wish to live in a house with my wife. With you. The you who plays the pianoforte as if you are starting a revolution. The you who understands the soil and the stars. The you I have been too blind to see." He did not reach for her. He did not try to touch her. He simply stood there, offering his confession, his raw, unvarnished truth, and waited. She looked down at the struggling orchid in her hands, its single, perfect bloom a fragile splash of color in the decay. "Words are easy, Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "They are ink on a page, easily written, easily spoken." "Then I will show you," he said. "Let me show you." It was not an immediate absolution. A wound that deep could not be healed with a single conversation. The door she had closed so quietly did not simply swing open. It had to be unlocked, slowly, and with great care. Alistair began his campaign not with grand gestures but with small acts of attention. He did not command, he asked. He would bring her a book he thought she might enjoy, and ask her opinion on it later. He would present a problem with the estate, a tenant dispute, a proposal for a new mill, and genuinely listen to her astute, well-reasoned advice. He started sitting with her in the evenings. At first, they sat in silence, an awkward, charged quiet that was vastly different from the empty silence of before. Then, one evening, he simply said, "Tell me about the music you were playing." She hesitated. Then, slowly, she began to speak. She told him about her teacher, a penniless but brilliant musician in her provincial town. She spoke of the mathematics of music, the emotional architecture of a sonata. He listened, not just with his ears, but with his whole being. He was learning a new language. He was learning his wife. The true test came a month later, at a grand ball hosted by their neighbor, the Earl of Danbury. It was their first major social event as a married couple. Alistair was acutely aware of the curious glances, the whispered comments. Lord Ashworth, his face flushed with wine, cornered him by the French windows. "So, Blackwood, you've brought the little steam engine out for a spin. Does she speak yet, or does she just whistle?" A year ago, Alistair would have ignored the comment or deflected it with a cold remark. But now, he felt a surge of protective fury so intense it startled him. He looked across the room and saw Alara standing with a group of ladies. She looked poised and beautiful, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. She was steeling herself for the evening. He turned back to Ashworth, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "My wife," he said, his eyes like chips of ice, "has more intelligence and grace in her little finger than you possess in your entire boorish person. If you ever speak of her with anything less than the utmost respect again, you and I will have a conversation from which only one of us will walk away satisfied. Do you understand me?" Ashworth, a bully who was at heart a coward, paled. He stammered an apology and beat a hasty retreat. Alistair did not know that Alara had been close enough to overhear the entire exchange. She had turned, just as Ashworth fled, and her eyes met his across the crowded room. He saw no triumph in her expression. He saw surprise, and something else. A flicker of warmth, a thawing. Later that evening, as they walked in the cool night air of the terrace, she spoke. "You did not have to do that," she said softly. "Yes," he replied, stopping to face her. "I did. An insult to you is an insult to me, to this family, to this marriage." He paused. "I would like this to be a marriage, Alara. A real one, not a contract, not an arrangement. Note." She looked up at him, the moonlight catching the amber of her eyes. "I do not know how to be that person anymore. The one you saw a glimpse of. You asked for a quiet woman with no opinions. And I was a fool," he said, his voice full of regret. "I am asking for you. Whoever you are. I want to know her. I want her to play the pianoforte so loudly it shakes the windows. I want her to argue with me about crop rotation and politics and poetry. I want her to fill that silent house with her presence." He finally, gently, reached out and took her hand. It was not trembling. "Please." She did not pull away. She simply stood there for a long moment, her hand in his, and then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The rebuilding was slow. It was a process of tending, like her work in the conservatory. Trust, like a fragile orchid, had to be nurtured back to life. But it grew. The house began to change. Music returned to it, first in hesitant melodies, then in glorious, passionate concertos. Laughter was heard, a sound so alien and wonderful it made the servants stop and smile. The dining room was no longer a silent continent of mahogany, but a place of lively debate and shared stories. Ilara's wit, it turned out, was as sharp and brilliant as her mind. It surprised him and delighted him in equal measure. They took on the restoration of the conservatory together. It became their project, a symbol of their own careful reconstruction. They cleared away the dead wood, repaired the broken panes, and brought in new, vibrant life. 1 year after their cold, efficient wedding, Alara stood with Alistair in the now thriving conservatory. The air was warm and fragrant with the scent of jasmine and orchids. Sunlight streamed through the clean glass. She was holding their son, a small, perfect infant named Arthur. Alistair looked not at the child, but at his wife. He saw the woman who ran his estates with a keen eye, who debated philosophy with him until dawn, who loved their child with a fierce tenderness, and whose music was the soundtrack of his life. He saw the woman who had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. "I was thinking," she said, her voice laced with the dry humor he had come to adore. "About your letter to Mr. Hemlock." He winced. "Must we?" "Oh, I think we must," she said, a smile playing on her lips. "You said I was plain, quiet, and would not embarrass the family with undue opinions." She adjusted the baby in her arms. "I feel I have failed you on at least 2 of those counts. My opinions, as you well know, are frequently undue. And as for quiet..." She looked down at their son, who chose that moment to let out a lusty cry. Alistair laughed, a real, unreserved sound. He reached out and drew them both into his arms. "You have failed on all 3 counts, my love," he murmured into her hair. "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever known, and you have never, not for a moment, been a disappointment. The only embarrassment belongs to the man who was too blind to see you." She leaned against him, the warmth of her presence a comfort he now could not imagine living without. The conservatory was full of life. The house was full of life. His heart was full of life. He had sought a simple, quiet solution and had instead found a complex, brilliant, and magnificent love. He had learned, finally, how to see. If you've made it to the end of their story, thank you for listening. Tell me in the comments, if you were Alara, What would have been the one condition you would have set for Alistair to prove his change of heart was real? Like and subscribe for more stories of love, loss, and the quiet revolutions of the heart. Our next story is a tale of a governess with a secret, a widowed earl with a broken heart, and a locked nursery that holds the key to both of their futures. They arrive here, in this small corner of the world, whenever they are ready.